Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to Rebel Without Applause, the Bill Kalmanson podcast, the video version, first time on Zoom. I'm here as I always am in this my nutshell of infinite space, right here in my television studio apartment in the Wood of the Holly, in the creative cradle known as Crotona, under the sign, which overlooks the post-apocalyptic and COVID-addled land of law. And post-apocalyptic is probably a good word for my guest that I have today. I'm so excited. He's one of the giants in terms of local historians here in Los Angeles. He's written brilliantly about it. He's a professor emeritus at UC Riverside, but he's with me here today. He is the author of The City of Quartz, and most recently, Set the Night on Fire, intimate history of the 1960s. He's with me across this little digital divide. Mike Davis, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm really excited.
My pleasure.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm fine. I've had a long 4-year struggle with cancer, but I've survived it, and I'm bunkered in the house with my 2 youngest kids who are still in high school.
Uh-huh.
So I've been having an absolutely great time. I know other people are freaking out, but it's given me the luxury. I have 4 children. My older children, I had to work 2-3 jobs at one point, but to be able to spend so much time with my teenagers and get to understand their experience of living through this in the Trump years and how they see the future, it's really been fascinating for me.
And are they optimistic?
I get asked, I've been asked for 30 years. People always ask me, but are you optimistic? Do you have hope? And I have the annoying habit of replying that hope isn't a scientific category. One doesn't struggle or commit one's life to a moral cause because of hope. It's necessity that drives us. It's the love of fellow human beings and human solidarity. I'm a radical who grew up in a basically cow town in eastern San Diego County, which was heavily Republican.
Yeah.
So I've never had illusions that it's simply the 1% oppressing us, or that revolution or social democracy is around the corner. The thing I'll say about my kids is they do have a bleak view of the future, but they have been so profoundly radicalized, not as a result of growing up in a house where their mom and dad are socialists, but by their generational cohort. They go to an inner city high school, San Diego High. Mm-hmm. My younger kids identify as Mexican, and their Black and Mexican friends from blue collar families are unbelievably committed to radical change. And I've had arguments with them about they're too young to vote, but if they were, why they should vote for Biden. And they just scoff at me for this. I feel like I'm a Menshevik addressing a group of young Bolsheviks. And to pay some medical bills, I went back to teaching last year, University of San Diego, which is a kind of conservative,
right,
wealthy Catholic college. And I was amazed to find the same attitudes among so many of my students. And Bernie Sanders conceded. Some of them even cried in class. But they understand, I mean, in the most profound kind of way, that it's either root and branch radical change, or, they see the world as, as being lost. So this is Generation Y or whatever. Is it Generation Y or Z? It's Z.
I don't know, but if it's Z, we're out of letters, so they're gonna have to go back to A, I guess.
Generation Z is an almost unique generation in American political history. because they're the generation that's going to witness the final build out of the human population by mid-century, the generations living in a new geological era, and a generation where the long frontal attack on rights that were won in the 60s and 70s allied to downward mobility, even amongst, solidly middle class kids,
Mhm.
has created a basis for not only for things like the Sanders campaign, but for taking a steadfastly oppositional approach in daily life. And I'm also blown away, since I went to a racist high school and blue collar high school in the early 60s, how incredibly good they are about issues of equality. And my daughter, younger daughter in particular, helped organize some of the early Black Lives Matter protests here. And I feel we're a bit like in this situation. Somebody once described the British Army as lions led by jackasses. And certainly this younger generation, are the lions, but they feel, with the exception, maybe of Bernie and Alexandra and so on, that they're led by jackasses in the mainstream Democratic leadership. And I mean, like I say, my kids wouldn't vote if they were eligible. And
Well,
I argue with them 24/7 about it, but they just, they're unyielding.
well, that's a huge, almost philosophical question right now. I mean, I think it damaged Hillary. Is that, are you willing to accept a first down, or are you going to only settle for a touchdown? Meaning this moment, I'm going to take that first down, meaning Biden, if I can get it. This is, I mean, for me, what are we, 3 days out from, I don't know if it's going to be a day of decision. It could be the next chapter of a lot of turmoil. What you're telling me is actually a hopeful message, because there's a generational awakening across many racial lines right now. But what's going to happen in 3 days? I'm not sure.
It seems that younger people who were resistant to supporting Biden are in fact going to vote. And I would say to even the most radical people that it's better to choose your enemy, and rather than have your enemy selected. I mean, this is for people who are the most hostile to Biden.
Yeah.
For some reasons. I mean, what we will get on Wednesday, unless we're overwhelmed by the chaos of electoral violence and voter suppression,
Mm-hmm.
is a return to an Obama administration. I mean, Biden's campaign staff, with the exception of the young Irish woman who's became his campaign manager in September, these are all the old guard from the Obama administration. People have been standing by his side for, in some cases, for 25 years. And it's a big question whether progressives will feel they own any part of this new administration. The day after the election, that struggle begins in the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
One thing, however, that I think some people are looking forward to and are going to be very disappointed by. I mean, they're looking forward to just getting Trump out of their life and not stuck in their face.
Yeah.
Trump will immediately buy his own television network, or one of the existing right-wing ones, and he'll be in our face forever. And in some sense, this is already a split decision, given that Mitch McConnell has achieved his ultimate goal of filling all the available federal judicial appointments with members of the Federalist Society, and carving into stone a Republican supermajority on the Supreme Court.
Do you think that assuming Biden gets there, that he'll have the political will to try to do what Roosevelt did. By that, I mean pack the court.
Yeah, I mean, Roosevelt in 1937 really attempted to transform American politics.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, by running progressive Democrats, New Deal Democrats, against old line reactionary Southern Democrats in the South. And secondly, face of the Supreme Court, it was adamantly hostile to New Deal reforms of enlarging it. It's been, the number of justices has changed 3 times. Of course, not in the Constitution at all.
The number of justices, yeah, that's not in stone. Yeah.
Well, even the duties of the Supreme Court are unclear. Judicial review, in the sense of using case law to essentially legislate results through new interpretations, is nothing in the Constitution. John Marshall introduced this when he was the first justice. I mean, what we've discovered in the last 4 years is how little ideas like the separation of powers mean when you have one branch or 2 branches of government aggressively set to expand their power in every way possible, because the Constitution is just it's a framework, and a loose one like that. So the big question is, are any of the mainstream Democrats willing to join with progressives and bring about some fundamental structural changes? The easiest thing to do, for instance, is to abolish the legislative filibuster.
Right.
Everyone, I think, agrees that the Electoral College is totally undemocratic.
Right.
How far will a Biden administration go? Will Biden reverse some of the power grabs by Trump? How about the War Powers Act? Will that be given new teeth? And I'm a little pessimistic. This kind of constitutional and structural reform is going to be supported, except maybe in a few marginal instances, by the new administration. But it's something progressives really have to focus on, along with key issues like, of course, universal health care and free public education.
To me, if there's any lesson from COVID, I mean, there's many of lessons, but the core one for me is that we can only deal with health on a collective basis. It isn't a commodity like pork bellies or oil or gold. It's only something that can be done and dealt with collectively. It's a private right and a public responsibility. Unless we see it like that, I think the virus forces us to, because if it's too virulent, all of our healths are tied together. I'm in a struggle within my own family where I have one family member who thinks masks are ridiculous. So I have to boycott every family gathering because I can't go. I don't want to silently, approve of that. I just can't,
Well, the Republicans in my family, at least, are wearing masks. But I think the thing that broke the hearts of so many thousands of people who've been activists, young people of color, especially in Sanders' campaign, was the concession of Medicare for all. I didn't understand this in the negotiations that occurred between these unity task force that were set up between Sanders and the Biden camps after his.
In other words, the Sanders people gave in to that demand or gave up that demand.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, they didn't give it up in the sense they promised to fight for it in the future, but they conceded to a platform that didn't incorporate it, but instead the enlargement of the public option.
Right. My
Biden,
feeling. Go ahead.
This to me was, a huge strategic error, particularly at a time when universal coverage obviously is a life and death matter. Also, I mean, there was a great deflation of hope after Sanders conceded, because the campaign had always portrayed itself as also a movement that was going to work equally on two fronts, using the electoral campaign to build the movement to build the electoral campaign. But after all was said and done, there was no movement. I mean, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren kept coming up with, wonderful proposals and legislation, but it wasn't translated into any kind of movement in the streets. And I think it would have lost tens of thousands of young activists. But then Black Lives Matter came along, and it recycled that energy. And in a sense, it rescued activism. And
Interesting. Yeah.
achieved things that, well, at least from my geriatric perspective, I thought were absolutely impossible. Like getting millions of people to at least consider the idea of defunding the police, or reconstructing public safety on an entirely new basis. That was extraordinary thing that happened.
Which reflects right back on Set the Night on Fire. And as you describe so brilliantly in the book, I mean, the LAPD with Chief Parker and Sam Yorty and the Cardinal McIntyre, that the whole unholy triad of tyranny in Los Angeles. It feels like, well, I think things are way better than they were, but a lot of this history feels recycled in certain ways to me.
Well, I mean, we've seen, very high level of police violence against BLM demonstrators in Los Angeles over the last 6 months. And I remember, this is a long time ago now, but at the end of the 90s, I got arrested at a demonstration supporting the struggle of food workers and house cleaning staff at USC. Their jobs, the university was going to contract out these jobs. And these people, many of them had their jobs for 10, 15, even 20 years. So I sat down with Maria Elena de Raza and the head of the Hotel Workers Union in Pershing Square, and some of the workers, and we were arrested. And almost every cop we had interaction with was a person of color, Latino, Black, Korean, as were the jailers. And at one point, I think a lot of liberals believe that if you have people of color in the police department, it would significantly change their attitudes. And I don't think any of us experienced that at all. It's the culture of the police. And until you shut down the police academy in Elysian Park and then reconstructed literally brick by brick in a policy and in a moral sense, the ghost of William Parker, Dragnet's police chief.
Oh yeah, Dragnet.
Chief at the time of the '65 riot. His ghost is still alive and well in the LAPD.
I remember growing up in the Valley in Tarzana, and I was little in 1965, but I remember just looking on from my white suburban balcony thinking, what the hell is going on over there? You know, it might as well have been Mars to the reality that I was living in. My concept of the police was formed by Jack Webb, but also Adam 12, where white police officers took kittens out of trees in suburban neighborhoods. And it's like, I don't even know how I became how I am. I don't know. I mean, somehow I felt like this suburban sameness, it's too fucking boring. I didn't, and this war, I want to go to Berkeley. It's happening there. I just want to go there. It's more exciting. And that was my journey. I'm curious because I have spent time in El Cajon. I spent a summer there with my cousin in like 1974. My family's in the radio business. And just
not KCBQ.
No, but in Los Angeles, you've probably heard these stations, KWKW, which is, we're the voice of the Hispanic community for generations. That's my dad and my brother, and also KIRN now, which is Farsi. It's the only Farsi station in LA. So that was another part of your book, and I'm taking a right turn, but KPFK and just the impact of radio in the 60s. You know, one hip DJ could say something and then the Sunset Boulevard would be filled, you know, with
Magnificent Montague, Burn Baby Burn.
yeah, I mean, just that whole thing. And I remember working at K Earth Radio. Now I'm a kid of the 70s, so I went to high school in the 70s, a little different than the 60s. In a way, I felt like I'd missed a lot, but the 70s had its own kind of truth too. I don't think it's been explored as deeply as the 60s, but it was its own thing. So my question to you is, you grew up in El Cajon and you're from Fontana, I believe. How did your transformation occur? What were the influences that added up to this socialist, brilliant historian, you know, activist? I'm always curious, especially in San Diego, which is basically a fortress for the U.S. military. I mean, it's you know, between the Marines and the Navy and all the research. It's, how did you become you?
Well, until I was 12 or 13, I was the most zealous Cold Warrior you could imagine, even at one point considering whether I should call the FBI about my dad. And my dad was kind of the, you know, meat and potatoes, New Deal trade union guy, lifelong member of the Meat Cutters Union.
Okay.
Whose leader, Pat Gorman, who was a social democrat, my dad admired. But he also had communist friends that he stuck by during the 1950s. Two Yugoslav butchers who had been dragged out actually on hearings on TV by California's little HUAC, the Tenney Committee. They were broadcast in San Diego. And these two guys, Bob Angus, were put on TV in front of all their friends and family. Lee Gregovich is the other one. And my father stayed loyal to him. My father was hugely popular guy. He was the ace bowler, went to national championships twice. He knew everybody in his industry, the wholesale meat industry. And I can't tell you how many times I was asked, Dwight's a prince. Why does he hang out with those Reds? And I only discovered a few years ago when my older sister was ill and died. And she was like Mona Lisa. My older sister was an incredible person, but she was very elusive and she knew all the family secrets, never told me or my younger sister. And all of a sudden she says, I said, God, Dad really should have gone to college. And she said, oh, he did for a year. He went to Ohio State. But then he went to that communist unemployed conference in Chicago and had to leave. So I spent my entire life thinking I'm not a red diaper baby in any way, shape, or form. And maybe I was. Yeah. But my father's side of the family come from what was the last Welsh-speaking community in the United States.
Interesting.
And still brags about being the smallest community in America to have its own website. It's called Venedocia, Ohio. It has less than 100 people in it.
In Iowa, did you say?
Yeah, Venedocia. And it was
in Iowa, though. In Iowa?
No, in Ohio.
Oh, Ohio. Okay.
Yeah, if people often ask me, what's your ethnicity? I say I'm an Ohioan. That's the old country. Born in California, but the old country that frames my memories and so on is Ohio. But anyway, I went there during the 90s, and I was trying to understand the kind of spectacular anti-racism of my father and his brother. Two of my cousins married people of color. I had black in-laws from the early 50s onward. And I'm walking around this town, which I think it had one little store that operated out of somebody's living room and one garage. And I go to the cemetery, and as in so many rural communities where generations have had to move out, the cemetery is very impressive. It contains, 10 times 100 times as many people as still live there. And suddenly I looked at all these Welsh graves, Davis and Jones, Williams, and so on, and died Shiloh, died Antietam. And I suddenly realized this was a little abolitionist stronghold. These were fiery religious people who thought that slavery was an abomination on the face of the earth. And I've always been interested in what kinds of memories or historical experiences are transferred down through generations and what kinds aren't. And I suddenly become aware that part of my father and uncle's attitudes were shaped by the history of this community and by its commitment to abolitionism.
Were they Quakers? Was that a Quaker community?
No, they had the community is still a bit famous because its Welsh church, Little Chapel, is the site of an annual choral music festival, Stephanie, whatever you get how it's pronounced in Welsh, and it was basically non-sectarian.
Mm-hmm.
Its thing was that it was Welsh and Welsh speaking. My mother was Irish by contrast, and although they're both Celts, the Irish and the Welsh were enemies in mining towns throughout the United States. The Welsh were more skilled, so they often became foremen or mine managers or so on. The Welsh were Protestant, and the Welsh were Protestant. The Irish Catholics, on the other hand, tended to be the guys who worked on the coal face or, dug copper. And so places like Butte, Montana, you'd have annual riots on 4th of July between the two groups. My mother and father had to elope to Kentucky and then keep their marriage secret for almost a year out of their fear that my great-grandfather, Jack Ryan, would, I don't know, maybe kill my father or something. The whole idea of an Irish Catholic girl marrying a Welsh, Welshman. And from my mother, I inherited something different, not so much the political inclinations,
Mm-hmm.
but, an absolutely fiery spirit. My dad was the most gregarious, kindest guy around. Kid would pick on me in school, and my dad said, "Turn the other cheek, just ignore the guy." My mother would say, "I'm going to beat the hell out of you with this belt, and let's go out and fight that kid."
That's funny.
Irish, and she was utterly a rebel throughout her life, even though she was a nominal Republican. When my father's employer demanded that everybody in their families vote Republican in 1932, my mother voted for Norman Thomas and then voted for him again 4 years later. And she's thought the worst people in the world, and this is reflective of old time conflicts inside Irish American communities, were the lace curtain Irish. Jackie Kennedy was her abomination. I remember my mom turning to me once and saying, $100,000 a year on drawers. I said, what are you talking about? $100,000 a year on underwear. This is what this woman spends. Children are starving.
That's hilarious.
So for her, the lace curtain Irish, which plays such a prominent role in the Trump administration and form a majority now on the Supreme Court, these were the worst sort of people. My mother was very defiant about being, from the Shanty Irish.
I dated a girl in Boston. I when I was living in New York, and she was from Boston, and she described herself as lace curtain Irish. And I went back to visit her family in Needham, And I was this Jewish kid from Berkeley, bopping in on my, my Cutlass, 69 Cutlass into this little, and they looked at me like I was a Martian, like, like, like this is their worst nightmare. And it's funny as you describe
I had a similar experience once with an Italian girlfriend from Bensonhurst. I had to hide in the car a block from her house. And I said, well, I'm white. She said, it doesn't matter. You're not Italian. My brothers will kill you on the spot.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah, that's funny because when you describe these differences within your own family, today people go, what are the differences? They're all white. There are no differences, but in fact, there were big differences culturally and hierarchically amongst white people in America. It's similarly, so my father, his father was born in Russia, and his story is unique in the American Jewish experience because he worked at Warner Brothers as a young guy and became president of Warner Brothers in distribution. And he had this, incredible journey. And my mother's family they were Berliners, Jewish Berliners. And I wasn't aware of it growing up, but I came later to learn that was also like, what the hell are you doing with this Russian, this kid, Well,
that's the story of Jewish immigration in New York with the German and Alsatian Jews, successful business community suddenly faced with hundreds of thousands of poor Jews from the shtetls of Austro-Hungary and from the Russian.
The Bloomingdales are faced with there was a great book about
similar
that.
To the curtain,
Our Crowd, I think, was a book that told that story.
The group that I felt was the most misguided because of ignorance of their history are Italian Americans. I taught for a couple of years at Stony Brook on Long Island.
Oh, yeah.
And got along famously with my Puerto Rican, Black, Irish kids from, who came from the city. But the Italian middle class kids, I even had, what's his name? Who's the last major mafia don to
Gotti.
go to prison?
Was it Gotti?
I had his niece in one of my classes. She could have been Princess Margaret or something.
His brother, Gotti's brother, owned Victor's Deli around the corner from where I live in Hollywood. And
really?
Yes, it's like, that guy's a Gotti. Yeah,
these kids, these suburban third generation Italian American, fourth generation Italian American kids could recite whole sections of The Godfather. They had it down. They were obsessed by it. And I started talking to them about the shirt waist strikers, about Vito Marcantonio, Italian Harlem's left-wing congressman for years and years, about all the Italian radicals in American labor history. But that history is something they're entirely cut off from. It's so important when you have some continuity of memory, when you know where you really come from, when that shtetl in Russia is something that still is part of your experience because you've bothered to find out about it and you talk to your grandparents. Mm-hmm. And in some groups, ethnic groups, particularly of white people who arrived in an ambiguous category as whether they were white or not, holding on to that radical memory is so important. Now, it's kind of odd that in American film, next to Scorsese himself, the director who's focused more attention and in many ways more sympathetically on Italian Americans and employed more Italian American actors, bar Scorsese, is of course Spike Lee. And I think it's in She's Gotta Have It. There's a scene in the candy store or something.
It was in the pizza parlor. I fed these kids. I think, wait, was it She's Gotta Have It? No, that was the first one. But go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it's where John Turturro starts telling his friends that they're
Yeah.
engaging in all this anti-black talk. He said, look at us, look at his skin color, come from Sicily.
Yeah.
We're Sicilians. Oh, a dozen different people, Arabs, Moors, the French, Romans, we're a mixture of all these things. It got right at the heart of the kind of alienation from one's past and from one's history that defines whiteness in America in so many cases.
Which makes an interesting point that I've struggled with personally as I wrote this book, the script, Central Avenue, and this thing, but the children, is that Spike Lee wrote brilliantly and deeply about this problem in the white culture. And so am always struggling. Yeah, I know. Bill's my age. Bill, you're just a white guy from the valley. You can't. I go, well, yeah, I am. So, but does that mean I can't? I have no authority to write these stories. I mean, it's actually been it's a problem that I have come up against. Is if you're not of the ethnicity that you're writing about, do you have the authority to even take that journey? But Spike did it well.
Well, I mean, there's another question that's parallel to this that I've had to face directly, which is what right does one have to portray other people's deepest sufferings and hidden selves, basically in order to achieve a best-selling book or a movie. And right at the time of the '92 rebellion in LA, I happen to know the mother of the guy who attacked the truck driver in this famous scene, beat him up
Denny,
very
Reginald
badly.
Denny.
I was active in a group of women, with a group of women whose kids were in jail. I had all these kind of inside sources to tell the story from kind of the other side. But then I thought long and hard about it, because for years I'd complained to people that what happened in the flatlands and minority neighborhoods of LA was never seen. The reality was unknown. And then I'm sitting around, because my two older kids are Irish, I'm sitting around Belfast around Christmas time. And suddenly Sky Channel today, nonstop, 5 episodes of America's Most Wanted and LAPD. And suddenly there's an image of the LAPD chasing some kid through a neighborhood that I immediately recognized. I think it was probably in Willowbrook. And I said to myself, when the New Deal asked photographers to go out and take pictures of human suffering, it was doing it in the service of a politics that might actually change people's lives. So somebody like Walker Evans or Dorothea Dix, they got a phone call from Washington. The Farm Security Administration needs images of migrant women. So they went out and basically stole these photographs. But it could be morally justified. I could not morally justify using personal relations with people to write about their lives. So the book that became Ecology of Fear was originally going to be a book about the '92 riots. And I got an incredible amount of money from Random House, from Knopf, to do it. I gave it all back. And since then, I've very rarely written about people. I kind of stick to, the archives, and particularly to science, which is a lot of what the Ecology of Fear book became. But these moral questions are the source of some of our most enlightening dialogues and kind of self-explorations. And I think that sometimes slogans are categorical injunctions about what you can or cannot write and so on. Really, really miss the mark. But other times, writing, which is considered to be, very mainstream and popular, can have some element of betrayal in it and dishonesty with the people who are the subjects of the writer. That's why in the 60s books, one of the heroes in it is a guy named Paul Jacobs, tough World War II veteran, labor economist, who, as I found out when I first moved to LA in 1965, was deeply respected and even loved in South Central LA. He did the report that exposed the fact that at a time when white unemployment was virtually disappeared, it was over 10% and increasing in Watts. After the 65 riots, of course, you had all these people writing books about it from the outside. He could have written a book as well. But what he did, in fact, is brought together groups of people that he known and worked with. And he became the amanuensis for them. That is, he edited their writing, he helped them with it, made suggestions, but in the last instance, they made all the decisions and issued the book. And always found this a kind of model for the relationship between an activist writer and a community.
Well, I was reminded in your story, about Bud Schulberg. Bud Schulberg I guess went down and mentored a whole generation of young writers after 1966 or 65, after the uprising.
Yeah, he founded the Watts Writers Workshop. He just went down to 101st Street and put up a notice saying, anybody who wants writing instruction, call me. I write a novel.
And it's amazing how. Go ahead.
And the Watts Writers Workshop was incredibly fertile because it produced some of the the finest writers of that generation, and actually created a kind of template for what became rap later on. There were similar theater workshops, art workshops. The Watts Renaissance, as we call it in the book, which is co-authored with my friend John Wiener, was the most important artistic event or process of the decade. It was, really extraordinary because the rebellion was experienced by people not as a tragedy or anarchy, but as a liberation that generated not only immense pride in the community, but also a unity amongst kids, younger adults and high school kids who belonged to competing gangs. Gang warfare disappeared from the streets of South Central for a whole decade as a result of the rebellion and the kind of radicalization, politicalization of kids on the street.
I can say this as a overprivileged white guy. I am an indirect beneficiary of that effort that Bud Schulberg initiated or helped, because amongst the people, as I read those chapters, there was the poet Kamau, I don't even know how to say it, Daoud, a poet who was part of that workshop. Did I say his name correctly? I don't even know. But he later, he later founded with Billy Higgins the World Stage, which is a performance space in Leimert Park, which is also an interesting story. I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but sort of as those folks started to move west with the breakdown of the housing covenants, that became sort of a relocated cultural center. And I played clarinet I'm a jazz player. So every Thursday night for the last 5, 6, 7 years, that has been my happiest, most welcoming place on earth is the world stage. And that jam session, Thursday, 9:00. And if there's one thing I am suffering from as a result of this virus, is there's no jam session, with my friends and the music. And that it's all part of this continuum, that I feel like I'm, just the beneficiary of. I always tell my friends, go integrate yourself. Your life gets a lot better. You don't need to wait. Go shop. The barbecue south of freaking the freeway is much better than anything you can get north of the freeway. Get out of go down, integrate yourself. And like my life got way richer, as I started to do that, as an adult. And, music has been sort of my ticket, but a lot of that, those, whatever you call those seeds were planted, I guess after 1965.
One story that's little known is the LAPD's 30-year war against interracial culture.
Yes.
The jazz community is a major target because, of course, Central Avenue was in the 1940s, almost up there with 42nd Street and so on,
Right.
or Harlem, is the center not only of jazz in LA, but above all, where rhythm and blues emerged.
Johnny Otis and those guys. Yeah.
So Chief Parker, as soon as he took over in 51, immediately started launching these so-called vice crackdowns, targeting white women or whites in general who were going to places like the great club Alabama.
Right.
Later on, in the rock and roll period, when so many young white kids were looking beyond rock and roll back to its real origin is rhythm and blues. The Vatican City of rhythm and blues was a record store called Dolphins of Hollywood, which had a regular
music store. Yeah. The radio was broadcast from there. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And when I was 16, a friend of mine, and I just got my driver's license, we went up to LA, drove to Hollywood, spent hours looking for Dolphins of Hollywood.
It's not in Hollywood. It's on Central and 44th or something like that. Yeah.
John Dolphin had understood very early on that better to brand at Hollywood than Dolphins at South Central.
Well, all of this is the canvas of my screenplay, the Club Alabama, the Hotel Dunbar. There's a scene where they walk in and they're buying records at Dolphins of Hollywood on Central Avenue. And there was the guy, I forget his name, Teddy Boy, or there was a famous DJ who was broadcasting live out of the Huggy Boy. And so this canvas, it's like, it's never really been explored in a dramatic way. It's like 42nd Street. As a matter of fact, the second you left Manhattan, the next best place was Central Avenue, and it was
that's correct. And in terms of Dolphins in Hollywood, so we finally found it, and it was the paradise that we'd expected. But at that point, it had very few white visitors. I drove up there, and this was in '63 when I was a junior in high school. And the reason was that Parker just parked a group of cops outside of Dolphins. And every time a white person would go in the store, they'd be harassed, told it was a dangerous neighborhood, or asked if they were on drugs. Now, of course, this continued into the 60s during the Watts Renaissance that followed the 65 uprising.
Mm-hmm.
And Doug Schulberg's Watts Writers Workshop that we've been talking about, after, first of all, being housed in this Presbyterian church on complex where a lot of the arts groups were after the rebellion, got its own brand new building. And it was immediately burnt down by someone who posed as a member of the group, but was in effect an LAPD agent. Burn it down. He he was never charged. He continued. He just started other fires, but he was such a good informant that the LAPD just turned a blind eye, even when he burnt down something as.
And this is like the prequel to Straight Outta Compton. I mean, these stories, they didn't just, like I always struggled with the term riot because it infers spontaneous combustion. Like they just go crazy. Things are okay. And then they riot. Whereas no, that's sort of why I wrote Central Avenue. That just didn't, this 65 thing just didn't happen. There had to have been, and this stuff, the cops were, like you say in your book, I'm sure I'm repeating stuff I learned from you, but Chief Parker was in the denazification program after World War II and basically got his core lessons from the Nazis and then recruited Southern guys to police the black neighborhoods, right?
Yeah, there's a great story about one of the LA Freedom Riders arrested and sent to infamous Parchman prison. While she's being processed, she looks on the wall, recruiting poster for the LAPD. Now, a lot of people would say the rebellion in 65. I don't, because I'm a labor historian of sorts, I don't have a problem with riots. But rebellion is fine, whatever you want to call it. But the thing is, a lot of people will concede that it was inevitable. I think it was absolutely necessary for the following reasons. In 1963, there was a mass united civil rights movement in LA that involved literally every significant Black church and group in the city, based on the Southern civil rights model. And it was utterly defeated. The next year, California white voters by 2/3 majority repealed the state's first open housing law.
14 was the prop, right?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
14. And then in the new year, 1965, where if you could somehow avoid the draft, a white kid, you could get up one morning and say, well, do I want to be an auto worker or a teamster or work in a rubber or steel plant? And you just go out and you'd get that job. That's when unemployment started increasing even more in South Central. And finally, to culminate the long history of police abuse, a young Black woman was picked up by 2 cops and raped. And
yes,
later, Beverly Tate, and later, some weeks after that, and after the rebellion, she was pregnant and found dead, most likely murdered. But the thing is, everybody in the Black community knew what had happened to her. If you read either the 2 major Black papers in town, it was front news. It only appeared in the LA Times once, far in the back section, 2 paragraphs. So white Angelinos were totally unaware of that. But everybody on the south side, the cops could come and rape your sisters. So when the highway patrol pulled over a couple guys for drunk driving, and it seemed to be non-controversial. A lot of neighbors were saying they're wrong. Then the LAPD shows up, and a young woman in the crowd, hairdresser, who's yells something to the cops. So they go over and the cop goes over and throttles her. And that was the spark that ignited an uprising that a whole generation of young Black people felt was absolutely necessary, because all the other means of redress, whether it's legislative action, it was nonviolent civil rights protest, had failed. And so, unlike the depiction of a riot being destroying your own community, this is not what happened at all. By the way, there are also white rioters. I was at that point the I've been sent by Students for Democratic Society. I wasn't a student, but I was a full-timer. I was sent to LA to help organize SGS chapters, and rented this part of a converted barn not too far from SC. And I was up on, Vermont. And at that point, it was a kind of German American neighborhood, German language theater. And a lot of poor white people lived there. They were looting the same kinds of stores, shoulder and shoulder with Black and Latino period. These are the stores so prevalent in the community at the time, where if you bought a bed, you'd end up paying for the price of a refrigerator. Bought a refrigerator, you end up paying the price of an automobile. These places gave you all this credit, and with like 10, 12% interest attached.
So there's this built up anger against these merchants as well that they felt.
I mean, and this is a problem because traditionally in inner city, in poor communities, almost anywhere in the world you want to go, it's usually an immigrant minority group. Okay, Palestinians own most of the markets in San Francisco and El Cajon, where I grew up now. All the liquor stores are owned by Iraqi Christians. So whatever the minority group is, whether it's Jewish or Armenian, Greek, Korean, and so on, they exist in a structural antagonistic relationship to the community, and of course attract looting and firebombing. One of the most incredible things during the 1992 uprising, the second one, and I was out all night and when it began in South Central, and then through the next day, and police made no effort to defend small neighborhood business. There was a police strike essentially being carried on. They wanted to punish the city and punish the neighborhoods. They just let things, it was a total laissez-faire attitude. I mean, they're shooting people down in the streets, but they weren't protecting any of the business. And of course, this was a huge shock for a relatively conservative Korean American business community to find out that, they had no police protection when push came to shove.
And now,
unfortunately, it's kind of interethnic component is been common in rebellions, and not only we're talking about inner city rebellions today, but when the Irish or the Italians were the inner city population, poor Jews. I lived in London for years, and the antagonism between ethnic store owners and poor people.
So the Indian people from South Asian store owners, perhaps, is that what you're describing?
Yeah, and of course this is what Spike Lee got so absolutely right, because he's a phenomenal sociologist, and not entirely without sympathy. I mean, the Italians are not depicted as just all evil, racist exploiters of the Black community.
Yeah, what was it? Danny Aiello goes, "I feed these people." I'll never forget that line. I think we're talking about the same movie where he goes, was he on the pizza parlor, the little Italian? Because I've been feeding these people, and you really, it was beautiful because it was real. It was his connection to that community was real.
Or you would look at his film On the Year of Sam, which again features Italian Americans.
Oh, the Son of Sam story.
Son of Sam, yeah.
Yeah, the Berkowitz thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was.
No, I mean.
Yeah,
he's so very attentive to local sociology, and what happens when people put on their ethnic suits and what happens when on those occasions where they actually take them off and try and look at other groups as human beings. I
Yeah.
think one of the greatest American novels, post-war novels, is precisely about that. I don't know if you've
Say,
read
say the novel again.
Blood Brothers by Richard Price. It's
No.
the odyssey of a young Italian-American guy whose fathers and uncles are trying to initiate him into their craft and they're high-rise iron workers or electricians. But he has a romance with a Puerto Rican woman, ends up working in the hospital with Black kids, discovers a whole new possibility for himself. But at the end of the day, he's struck back down by, by his family. It's an absolutely brilliant portrayal of someone struggling and failing to escape uh, the whiteness boundaries of his life and his family.
Mm-hmm. Wow. You know, my own experience as a comedian trying to break into the white clubs on Sunset Boulevard, and it was very harsh, very cruel, very tough. But then when I went to go play jazz in South Central, it was completely welcoming. It was a totally different experience. And I went, oh, okay. It's like, I mean, it's all part of, you know, my education. It keeps going, but
I love Hollywood and the industry for one thing.
mm-hmm.
Is exactly as it is portrayed. Oh, it's unwaveringly true to its own stereotype and caricature. I once had this real experience. I'm friends with the actor Viggo Mortensen.
Oh yeah.
And
yeah.
he has a small press, and I wrote a couple of teenage science adventure novels for him based on adventures I had with my older son, who died. And he took me to, what is it, CCA, the biggest.
Oh, CAA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He takes me in there, opened the door, and there's this huge Claes Oldenburg sculpture. All of a sudden, all eyes are focused. There's like a stairway and mezzanine. They're all looking at Vigo. And the beautiful young blonde woman comes up to me, takes my hand and says, "Oh, we really love your manuscript." And I'm thinking to myself, this is fantastic. You don't have to worry about the nuances and the complexity of it.
No.
Exactly as it is. Vigo, by the way, is a really wonderful human being.
Good actor too.
Who's, he totally waterproof to this kind of.
Yeah.
Pays no attention to it. But for me, I had held out no hopes this would actually end up in a movie. But it was a sensational insight because people like me, itinerant radicals, a few opportunities to actually see power in its kind of, elemental, pure phase, as you would here in Hollywood or in DC. I've been to DC once for a demonstration, and I have no real apprehension or experiential knowledge of what it's really like. The closest I came to understanding what the bourgeoisie was being a tour bus driver for Gray Line tours, the tours of Hollywood.
But Graveline?
Gray Line.
Because I did Graveline, but go ahead.
Yeah, I know about that.
In the hearse. Yeah.
I did the Gray Line and the pilot.
Yeah, with the speaker. Yeah.
So I went to college when I was almost 30, and I wanted a job that I could allow me to live as a grown man that I considered myself. But I would do these charters. People would come in on a cruise ship in Long Beach, and I'd pick them up and drive them somewhere. Oh. And I met people of such supreme moral disillusion. I mean, so naive and so utterly shocked by how so many of the Nouveau Riche live. Now, I have friends, some of the best people I know grew up in wealthy families, but they grew up with some sense of, not so much of a blessed liege. They grew up with some sense of service and duty. They're really fine people. But the people I was encountering, this is Trump space before it was Trump space. I was just appalled by their immorality in so many ways.
I mean, I'm conflicted. My grandfather was a movie executive, and I didn't participate. I was a kid in the Valley, so I didn't. He lived in New York, and those Santa Monica Mountains might as well have been the Himalayas. So it was a world that I thought was infinitely more interesting and better than the world that I lived on near Ventura Boulevard. But I don't know. I don't even understand myself now. The influences that add up to whatever this is. But I'm impressed by reading about Bud Schulberg, because I felt a connection to that, because after all, his father was a very powerful movie executive, B.P. Schulberg. And obviously
of course, but he really was an interesting figure.
Yeah.
Because he's someone who grew up with the privilege, but rebelled against it while staying in the game.
Right. What makes Sammy run?
I hate film screenwriters in American, history.
Yeah.
I mean, the industry has always been interesting because it was so heavily Jewish, and even the moguls often came from off the streets. Off the boats. And so you could have, raging reactionary Republicans at the head of the studio, but then you'd have writers and craft workers and so on, who were as militant as any labor group in the country.
Yeah.
Largest, most violent strikes in American history.
Yeah, Bud Schulberg also, for anyone who's listening, he wrote a masterpiece called "The Face in the Crowd" and "On the Waterfront." So he's a giant,
It's funny, yeah. I had a friend once who, whose dad, they were Swiss Jews. His dad, I forget his first name, last name was Dierenforth, and he was a famous character actor, playing Nazi officers, blonde and blue-eyed. And his uncle, my friend's uncle, his brother, was also played the same role. And it's one of the delis out in the valley, where I was introduced to the two of them. They're sitting there ordering kosher, wearing.
Just finished doing Nazi parts. Well, Mike, I got to tell you, this could, for me, go on forever. You are a wonderful raconteur, and you're just a wealth of history. And I want to remind people, check out his latest book. It's Set the Night on Fire, or Set the Night on Fire. A very cool reference to the Doors, although I didn't read much about the Doors in the book. Maybe I missed it, I don't know, but it's a great book. It's just an incredibly interesting and deep canvas, and you do it in an intimate way that makes it even better. It's like so many historians, write seemingly just for their academic others, but your writing, reaches to the public. And so I really appreciate that. And I just want to thank you before I run out of space on my hard drive here. But you are terrific, and I loved your books, both of them, and I'm looking forward to reading some of these others that I wasn't even aware of. But The City of Quartz is a masterpiece in terms of understanding Los Angeles. And like I said,
can barely remember what I said in it, but thank you very much.
Well, it is. I read it over 8 years ago, but I know that it was very important for me when I wrote the screenplay Central Avenue. And it's just the idea that these cops, like an occupying Nazi army, just beating the shit out of these people, and just how insulted they were by cross-cultural connectivity between artists and romances. And then also,
I have to ask you before.
What's that?
Before we leave, I have to ask you one question.
Go ahead.
since you are flautist, did
Clarinet.
oh, clarinet? Okay.
Okay.
But still, did you know John Carter?
Did not. Wait.
One of LA's most along with uh, 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 Tapscott, one of the
Horace Tapscott in the orchestral. Yeah, he would be before my time for sure.
John Carter did this incredible, I don't know, I think 5 or 6 record, basically history of Black people in America, and it's absolutely magnificent work.
It's a musical piece.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
he's a jazz musician who, like Tapscott, could have gone to New York,
He stayed.
but stayed and taught in the schools. But
Right.
incredible musician. Yes, he played the clarinet too.
Yeah, you know what? You mentioned him in the book, and I actually did do a little listening. I go, who is that guy? I got to hear him. And it was this free jazz sort of. It was a certain Ornette Coleman moment. I guess this would be what, the 70s. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think when that would be.
Well, the reason I don't know about the Doors is because I was totally listening to Eric Dolphy and
you were in the jazz space,
Dolphy.
yeah.
But later on, to make a long story very, very short, I went to Paris to meet the Viet Cong in 1973 at the peace negotiation. And then we went to this famous cemetery, Père Lachaise in Paris, where the last battle of the Paris Commune was fought. We were having this ceremony. And while we're standing in front of the Mur de Fédéré, where the communards were shot, I look to my side and there's this beautiful pre-Raphaelite young woman just sprawled piteously over a tomb. And I asked one of the Vietnamese comrades, should we call the gendarme, or ambulance? And he says, oh no, she's exactly where she wants to be. And I said, where's that? In the arms of your great blonde god from California. I say, who's that? It's Jim Morrison.
It's
great.
Yeah.
That's how far out of the, that's why the sections that have to do with popular culture and so on, apart from the Watts Renaissance, were all written by my friend John Wiener, who's the biographer of John Lennon.
Oh, right. Of course. Yeah. Well, the jazz canvas is, you know, another person I don't have time, but Dexter Gordon and Jefferson High School and the music program there, and a whole generation of jazz giants right there.
Yes.
And Charlie Parker shows up and changes the world, you know, basically. Yeah. So anyway, I'm afraid my computer's going to crash because this is my first, I don't know how much hard drive I have, but this is wonderful. And I so hope that I get to meet you in person sometime under safer circumstances. I would have gladly driven down and just sat with you with my little microphone, but this is how it is right now.
Well, according to Fauci, maybe 2022.
Yeah, 2022. That's what it is. You know,
I have to go. I really enjoyed talking to you, and all
Likewise.
The best with your podcast.
Thank you so much, Mike. You take care. Bye-bye. So there you have it, folks. A very long serpentine conversation with the great Mike Davis. Get a chance, check out his great books, City of Quartz and Set the Night Afire, his most recent book about the 1960s. And I think it's just critical to understanding the city we're in, Los Angeles, the land of law. So till next time, folks, namaste, shalom, and aloha, live courtesy of Zoom. This is your Rebel Without Applause saying Nama Shaloha.